It happened in the early hours of Saturday morning. While most of Europe was still asleep, missiles were already falling on Tehran. The United States and Israel launched a massive joint military campaign against Iran, striking the capital Tehran along with the cities of Isfahan, Qom, Karaj, and Kermanshah. And when Europe woke up, the world had already changed. Today, we're breaking down exactly what happened, why Europe is alarmed, and what this conflict could mean for the continent and for all of us. I'm your host, and this is European Focus News. At 2:30 in the morning, Washington time, President Donald Trump appeared in a video and announced the United States was engaged in what he called a major combat operation aimed at, in his words, eliminating threats from the Iranian regime. The strikes killed Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, an 86-year-old cleric who had ruled Iran since 1989. Trump posted on Truth Social, calling Khamenei's death the single greatest chance for the Iranian people to take back their country. Netanyahu, appearing alongside Trump in coordinated statements, said the strikes were necessary to prevent Iran from ever acquiring a nuclear weapon and called on the Iranian people to cast off the yoke of tyranny. But here's where it gets complicated from a European point of view. Just days before the strikes, on Thursday, indirect nuclear negotiations in Switzerland had actually been making progress. Iran had reportedly agreed never to stockpile enriched uranium and accepted full international verification. Oman's foreign minister, who brokered those talks, said a breakthrough had been reached. And yet, the bombs fell anyway. The question Europe is now asking is, was this really about the nuclear program, or was it about regime change? Iran did not stay silent. Within hours, the Iranian regime launched retaliatory missile strikes across the Persian Gulf, targeting U.S. military bases in Bahrain and the UAE. Explosions were reported across the Gulf states. And then came a move that sent shockwaves through European capitals. Iran's Revolutionary Guards closed the Strait of Hormuz to all shipping. The EU's own naval mission, Operation Aspides, which patrols the Red Sea corridor, immediately went on high alert. Think about what the Strait of Hormuz means for Europe. Approximately 20% of the world's oil supply passes through that narrow waterway. Energy markets in Frankfurt, London, and Paris reacted instantly. Oil prices spiked. Hungary's Prime Minister Viktor Orban, one of Trump's closest European allies, skipped the politics and went straight to the economics. His first public statement wasn't about war or peace, it was about oil prices. For ordinary Europeans already dealing with high energy costs, this war in the Middle East just got very, very personal. So how did European leaders respond? The reaction from the continent was united on one thing, alarm, but deeply divided on how to respond. Let's start with France. President Emmanuel Macron did not mince words. He called the strikes an outbreak of war, saying they carry grave consequences for international peace and security. He immediately called for an urgent UN Security Council meeting, and France, as a permanent member of the Council, pushed hard to get one. Germany and the UK joined France in a joint statement. The three countries made clear they had not participated in the strikes. They didn't explicitly condemn them either, a careful diplomatic tightrope, but they did condemn Iran's retaliatory missile attacks and called for a resumption of negotiations. The European Union spoke through two voices. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen called the situation greatly concerning and urged restraint, but European Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas took a somewhat more nuanced position, acknowledging Iran's record of violence and its nuclear ambitions, while insisting that protection of civilians and international humanitarian law is a priority. Norway went the furthest of any European country in its criticism. Foreign Minister Espen Barth said the initial Israeli strike breached standards of international law, arguing that a preventive strike requires an immediately imminent threat
and that this threshold was not met. Ireland's Prime Minister, Michael Martin, whose country has been among the most vocal critics of Israeli military action in recent years, strongly urged all parties to exercise restraint to avoid wider conflict. And then there's Ukraine. President Zelensky, in a striking twist, actually supported the U.S. action, calling Iran Putin's accomplice and saying that whenever there's American resolve, global criminals weaken. He linked the Iran strikes directly to Russia's war, a reminder that for Kyiv, these conflicts are not separate. Europe spoke in many voices, but on the streets, the message was clearer. In London, protesters gathered within hours of the news breaking, holding signs condemning the strikes and calling for peace. Britain's Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, chaired an emergency COBRA meeting, the government's crisis committee, as the UK weighed its response. The UK did deploy RAF Typhoon jets to Qatar to protect the Al Udeid air base, but London was clear it did not want to see further escalation into a wider regional conflict. In Berlin, Paris, and other European capitals, anti-war protests were organized within the day. Many held signs connecting the Iran strikes to the ongoing war in Gaza, a sentiment felt strongly across much of southern and western Europe. The public mood in Europe is of deep unease. People here remember what wider Middle East wars mean: refugee crises, energy shocks, and the risk of terror attacks on European soil. Here's the question many security experts in Europe are quietly asking right now. Could this war reach us? The Atlantic Council warned that Iran has a long history of conducting terror attacks, cyber attacks, and assassination plots across Europe. Past operations have been linked to countries including Sweden, Albania, and Germany. Iran's network of proxies, including Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis, have operatives and sympathizers scattered across the globe. Even without direct military conflict, Europe could face cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, attempted assassinations of dissidents living in European cities, or sleeper cell activations. European intelligence agencies are already on heightened alert. At sea, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz, if it holds, could cause energy supply disruptions not seen since the 1970s oil crisis. Europe has spent years trying to diversify its energy sources after the Russia-Ukraine war. A prolonged Gulf conflict could undo much of that progress. And there's a deeper political question for the EU. Europe was left out of the decision. The US and Israel did not consult Europe before launching these strikes, even as those same strikes directly affect European energy, security, and the refugees who may soon be fleeing Iran. The EU's role as a diplomatic actor on the world stage is once again being tested. So where does this leave us? The US and Israel have launched what may be the most consequential military operation in the Middle East in decades. Supreme Leader Khamenei is dead. Iran is retaliating. The Gulf is on fire. And Europe, the continent that borders this chaos, was not consulted, was not involved, but will absolutely feel the consequences. The E3, France, Germany, and the UK are walking a tightrope. They want to preserve the Atlantic alliance with Washington while also asserting that international law matters, that diplomacy should have been given more time, and that civilian lives in Iran are not acceptable collateral damage. Whether Europe can turn its alarm into action through the UN, through sanctions, through diplomacy, remains to be seen. What is certain is this: the world changed on February 28, 2026. And for Europe, the question is no longer whether this war matters to us. It already does. If you found this breakdown valuable, please subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video. We'll be updating you with new developments as they happen. This is European Focus News, reporting the world through European eyes. See you in the next one.